Okay, so now we're rolling.
Now we're rolling.
Okay, I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is TRILLOQUY, True and Real Stories from the Fringes of Classical Music. So on today's opus of TRILLOQUY, we're going to talk a little bit about film music, and we have a couple guests who work in film and commercial music that you'll hear from in a bit. But first, Scott, I kind of wanted to think about some of our favorite films and maybe even film scores. So if someone asks you the question, what's your favorite movie? Are you even able to answer that? It seems like a difficult. Oh, you have a favorite movie,
The Fisher King.
The Fisher King.
Yep.
And you have yet to show that to us.
I haven't showed that to you
I've
yet?
never seen The Fisher King.
Oh, well, we're going to fix that very soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, talk to me about The Fisher King. Why do you love it so much?
I think it was one of those, you know how sometimes you see a movie at the right point in time in your life?
Yeah.
I think that was one example of it. Forrest Gump was another example.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, and The Color Purple.
The Color Purple.
Yeah, all of those things were just, all of those were very poignant films. I just saw them at the right time.
I have to say, and maybe it's me falsely or inappropriately judging, but the first time you told me that you loved The Color Purple and that you actually knew the movie, it's not just one of these films you've seen once, I was a little surprised, actually.
Were you?
Because, The Color Purple is very much a part of Black culture when it comes to some of these inside jokes. And, every time I go home and there's a guest there, I'll say, "Hoppo, who this woman?" Or, or of course, there's the "all my life I had to fight," and all of these little soliloquies and colloquies in that film.
It's loaded with them.
And really great music written by who? Do you remember who's behind
Quincy
that score?
Jones.
Quincy Jones. Yeah, and a lot of people don't think about him as a quote unquote classical guy, but he had beginnings. He studied with Nadia Boulanger, and of course produced stuff for Michael Jackson and all that stuff. But his score to The Color Purple is really beautiful, and we even air some of that music every now and again.
You were talking about themes in this interview with Will and Vela. How Leia's theme is just sort of, so iconic and part of the fabric. I think that Quincy's main theme, Seeley's theme, I think is so quaint and simple and beautiful.
What beautiful music and what a beautiful story. Next time, Scott, when we're all sitting around the table and there are folks around, we'll have to reenact that dinner scene toward the end of the film. Because I basically know everybody's part. My favorite person, and me and my friends down in Memphis, shout out to Ian. Man, I miss Ian. Every time he came over for dinner, we would alternate playing different people. I was really good at Oprah's character.
I was going to say I could do that. Confused.
But I'm good at Whoopi Goldberg's lines too, especially when she gets mad at Mister. Talking about I never asked you for anything. I never asked you for nothing. Or
right.
She's begging on the table, and man, what a powerful movie.
That shaving scene though.
Yeah, she almost got him, and Suge saved his life, didn't she? Sister saved his life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That razor looks dull to me, Miss Seeley.
Yeah,
and she's.
But imagine living that reality, just living post, and I wasn't expecting to go down this little rabbit hole, but, when you think about The Color Purple, that is not a movie that takes place during antebellum slavery, but the reverberations of it are still very much there. People living on these farms, and of course, racism is alive and well. And go revisit the Color Purple. Maybe even one day, I'll get to come up to work and tell you I was married now. Or maybe you.
Right. That'll be the shocker of the century.
But, so for when someone asks me what is my favorite movie, I name three. I have three favorite movies. The Matrix,
Hmm.
And I really only count the first one because,
Same.
really, really incredible music to that one. Kill Bill, which I count both of those movies,
Hmm.
which has a very eclectic film score, but then also The Shining. I really love that movie, first of all, but the music is just so
It's a
intense.
character.
It's a character in the film, and it even starts with a melody that you hear a lot in classical music. So, of course, the Dies Irae, a melody that a lot of composers are sort of obsessed with. Sergei Rachmaninoff, for one, is even inscribed in his only on his only standing statue, which stands in Knoxville. Did you know that?
I didn't.
Yeah, the only statue of Rachmaninoff in the whole world is in Knoxville, and
Cool.
yeah, I have a few photos there that I'll show you sometime. But in addition to having our favorite movies, I have a favorite movie score. So The Village, M. Night Shyamalan, the movie is fine. It is what it is. I saw it in the theaters, but hearing that movie score for the first time was really I don't know, just transfiguring for me, or I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it was just so beautiful. But then also just simple in a really beautiful way. The solo violin part played throughout by Hilary Hahn.
Mm.
I often call that movie the Hilary Hahn Concerto.
Good.
But it was conducted. I have another important tie to that music because Lucas Richmond, who conducted that score, that studio session, gave me my first permanent job. So he hired me on into the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra. So
Cool.
and we air some of his compositions here at APM every now and again. But yeah, so I have my favorite movies, but I definitely have my favorite movie music score. Yeah, shout out once again to Hilary Hahn. Man, she really sounds beautiful there. All right, well, on this again, like I mentioned, on this opus of Trilloquy, we're talking with two musicians, a composer by the name of Will Vander Crommert, and a cellist. Her name is Vela Farquharson. I'm so sorry, Vela, if I'm mispronouncing that. I did my little easy way to pronounce it here, Farquharson, Vela Farquharson, and they have some really beautiful music that they play that we're going to close out this opus of Trilloquy with. We're going to talk about not just film music, but commercial music in general, music used to sell things for commercials so it should be a good one. But before we get into that conversation, I just thought, do you have any idea who wrote the very first film score? Who's credited with that? And it's a composer but one you might not think of.
Charlie Chaplin.
Earlier than that. I'll give you a hint. He is French. A French composer wrote the first film score.
Well, obviously, I'm going to think in the Ravel and Debussy realm, but
Sure. Well, the first film score composer is actually a guy named Camille Saint-Saëns.
Do tell.
He wrote the score to a film. I think I'm trying to remember the English title in French. It's Assassination Duc de Guise, or the Assassination of the Duke of Guise. So and Guise, not the Duke of Guise. Hey guys,
Right.
So you should definitely read up a little bit about that film. I don't know if it's easy to find the film, but the music is still very much out there. So as we transition into this conversation with Will and Vela, how about we hear a little bit of the very first film score? Well, thank you so much for joining us here today on Triloquy. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here. Thank
and
you.
Vela, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to having some chats about film music and commercial music. But Will, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Will van der Crommert?
Who is Will? That's for sure. So I'm a composer for film, television, and commercial media. A lot of us kind of tend to straddle all those different camps. I started out as a composer. I just knew that I was far more interested in playing and creating music rather than just playing music that other folks had written. I mean, both are wonderful processes. There's a real discipline, to studying the work of other composers, but I was so interested in writing my own. And that was kind of the catalyst for everything that has kind of followed thereafter.
And how did the two of you become connected?
Vela, you got that one?
Yeah, that was actually through my husband, who's also a musician. You and Matthew are childhood friends, right? Yeah. So when we moved to Minnesota, we just reconnected.
Yep, we reconnected, and then through conversation, I found out that Matthew, who's a violinist or string player as well, had married a cellist, and I'm like, oh man, I've got session players hostage now. This is great.
I love these neighboring nests of musicians that just live. I think that's great. So when I first met you, we had our first meeting. What struck me the most is that you moved. You're from here, from Minnesota. You moved to Los Angeles. And you moved back. And no shade to Minnesota. It's beautifully cold here, but it seems like living in Los Angeles would be something you would want to do considering your line of work.
Absolutely. And I don't think I would have a lot of the opportunities that I've been fortunate enough to take advantage of now if I hadn't had that season of life that I spent out west, but to move to Los Angeles and to stay, to be a transplant, which ironically enough, most everyone who lives in Los Angeles
lived there,
is.
I know, yeah.
Right? No one's actually from Los Angeles. But to move there and live there and stay there is to adopt a lifestyle and to adopt a culture and to adopt a work-life balance that wasn't for me. That on top of the fact, I moved away from a family not knowing that, man, we're really close. Sometimes you have to move 2,000 miles away from home to realize that your family's actually really tight-knit.
Sure.
So there were a lot of factors that ended up going into my decision to move back. But again, if I hadn't spent time out there and hadn't spent time pounding pavement and been lucky enough to end up in some really great studios and get some really great writing opportunities, I don't think I would have had as many doors open for me here in Minnesota as I've been lucky enough to have.
Sure. And, when you talk about pounding pavement, just, all of that comes after all of the practice room pounding and that sort of thing. Why don't the both of you tell us a little bit about your musical upbringing and how it became a sort of a career for you?
Well, my mother is an opera singer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I grew up with music playing nonstop. I mean, whether it was classical music and jazz on the radio and going to see operas, my mom singing in operas when I was like 4 years old.
Would your mom sing at home, like practice at home?
Yeah, and then singing at home and having students singing at home. It was kind of always in my heart. And then I heard Jacqueline Dupre playing the cello.
Of course, yeah.
And as cheesy as that may be, I was in love. And yeah, I started playing piano first. My mom thought that would be a good thing for me to start on, just to get a good sort of basis. And then a year later, I started cello. And, I knew pretty soon that it was going to be this huge part of my life that it's like once it's there, you can't leave it,
Yeah. What about you, Will?
Yeah, so I came up in kind of a musical family as well. My father, though he isn't a musician, the man is a shameless promoter of my mother and I, who are musicians. He appreciates music enough to be a musician for all intents and purposes. But my mother is a classical and folk fingerstyle guitarist. She taught for about 15 years, continues to teach actually. She kind of came from musical stock as well. So my great-grandmother, ironically enough, played piano for silent films. We're talking, we're talking before talkies, right? Title cards to explain dialogue and things like that. My late great Uncle Med was a Grammy Award-winning jazz musician in a band called Super Sax. And then my grandmother was a pianist and a singer as well. So my mother kind of perpetuated all of that in my sister and I. And I kind of early on, I was dabbling on the piano, and I would sneak downstairs and listen to my sister practicing, and I'd wait right around the corner and quietly correct her in my head. That's a half step wrong, just see if you can fix that note there, And it wasn't long before I was asking for piano lessons, recording on a 4-track Tascam, and discovered the computer shortly thereafter. It's not like the computer was a new invention. I had just discovered it subsequently.
Sure.
But yeah, so I mean, it was just kind of omnipresent. A guitar in every corner of the house, an old creaky Whitney upright downstairs, and parents that were very willing to allow band practice to happen at 10:30 to midnight.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
Mozart started off the same way. The piano was delivered for his sister.
Yeah.
So he started playing it. So you're on your way, man.
There you go.
If not already there.
All part of the process.
When it comes to I'm a first generation professional musician, so I played bassoon professionally for a decade. And for my family, it was just very odd, just to think about, first of all, understanding that this is a profession that you could get into, and then much less making it work, but with the two of you coming from musical families, I wonder if the specific sorts of the specific corners of classical music that you landed in, if that was sort of unfamiliar, or did they have doubts surrounding what that future could hold for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting going into a career like that where you're not sure where will it lead to and everything like that. For me personally, like, my mother was always fully supportive, and if you're working hard enough, and she was always making it possible for me to travel, and experience different things. As a musician, having freelanced for a little while, I kind of realized that I wanted to add more to my mental palette, if you want to say.
Yeah.
So I actually got into software. So now I'm kind of juggling the two. But, I think that having that other side, I feel like it's liberated me to take on musical endeavors that I really want,
Yeah.
And I'm just so excited to see how that will take my career, over time.
And then, talking about software, software is, it seems like, if you have a second instrument, a second primary instrument, it's the computer in a way.
Right. And actually it's a steep learning curve for anyone that approaches music intuitively. I think if I had to liken it to something, it's kind of like studying music theory for the first time, because we have music, this thing that we approach intuitively and with a lot of heart and emotion, and it's something that we access on a soul emotional level, right? And then suddenly you walk into your first year theory class and you want me to think about music and analyze what I'm doing? No, this is just a natural extension of self. I think the computer in that respect is a bit like that, because it's very debilitating until you gain a certain amount of fluidity with it.
I see. Just like any other instrument, really.
Absolutely. When it's all about your ability to manipulate the instrument. That's always what it's come down to. So I think it's a really fair parallel to say that the computer is my third instrument.
Do you remember the first day sitting in front of Pro Tools or whatever you use and just thinking to yourself, what in the hell am I going to do?
I think I blacked out in frustration.
Okay.
if I had to remember it. And it's like anything else. We start off with chopsticks and then we're playing Brahms, right? And people assume that that's kind of the graduation, but there's all these kind of little things in between that happen. Maybe we take on some Bach inventions, and then maybe we learn a pop tune that we're just absolutely mad for. And all these things kind of happen in between. So for me, it was like I sat down, looking at a lot of different program windows and being absolutely baffled. That was chopsticks, right? But then suddenly you start asking questions and you start listening to what a lot of other artists are doing. It's like, those drums are really cool. How do I program drums that sound like that? I was absolutely infatuated with Adam Young of Owl City, who is, of course, a Minnesota Owatonna native. And he had these incredibly dense but light electronica drums that I spent so much time trying to recreate, and by doing that, I essentially taught myself not only how to program drums, but write for drums, So these things kind of just become extensions of curiosity and question and creative ambitions. It just kind of falls in line one after the next, much like any, instrumental coursework would.
Yeah. So, when you're learning to work with all of this software, did that come before or after or during you're actually taking these gigs? I guess we need to line up. So you went to school and you studied piano. And then I think I remember from our previous conversation that, studying theory and getting into form kind of got you more into the composition side of things. So I guess I want a little bit of clarity about the journey from, okay, I'm going to be a composer to I'm taking commercial clients and I'm writing a very specific type of music.
Gotcha. So I think they absolutely happened in tandem with one another. But at the same time, I think I just had a very early curiosity for music. Before I was reading music, before I was taking lessons, I was at the piano picking out the theme to Forrest Gump, right? That was my thing. And then took some piano lessons and joined some bands, and I think it was somewhat out of necessity that the computer kind of emerged. I needed to make a recording. I had the band needed a recording, right? So, Will, you're the front man. We should add that to your list of already huge responsibilities, right? Because the front man always gets the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
But I had a godfather that sent me a computer. He had worked for Apple for some time. He said, "You know what? I'm not using this. Just experiment." And so that's exactly what I did. And I think I became really interested in the fact that I didn't need to wait for my friends to come over, or I didn't have to call players. Suddenly, I had the whole paint palette at my fingertips. And it allowed me to take chances and experiment and grow as a composer. So that was kind of these two things happening in tandem, approaching composition very intuitively, but at the same time, kind of the tech emerging alongside it.
When you look at that tech, wasn't that daunting, though? You said, and all of a sudden now you've got access to this whole palette of colors. Like you, when I first got everything installed and ready to go, I went, oh my God, there's so much.
It's really interesting. I remember the first day that I got my first serious, nuclear grade orchestral sample palette. And I think I had just spent so much time listening and lusting after that sound and assuming that it was unattainable, that by the time I finally got it, it was so intuitive and I was just ready to go. I did my first mock-up in 10 hours after I got the software. And I mean, that's kind of the scary thing, is that with softwares like these, it takes about 10 hours to churn out 3 minutes of fairly convincing music. Never replacement for live players, though. That's always something that should be said alongside that.
And that's what I was going to jump onto. And Vela, I was going to ask you, are you not threatened by the idea that Will doesn't actually need you to record something beautiful?
I think he needs me.
Okay, yeah.
Kidding?
Sure.
Of course.
I think it's important to embrace the new things and, just see how is it changing and how can I fit into that, and whether it's, you record this yourself and then, I come in later and, make it more pretty, I'm okay with that, and I think that, I think it's only important to look forward, not to kind of be worried about what will happen. So, personally, I've experimented playing electronic music, with my electronic cello and kind of putting it through the computer. And I realized that you can actually get even cooler sounds if you use a live instrument through the computer. So, that's kind of how I've also tried to experiment.
So you do need Vela after all.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and it's really interesting too. I think the second that either instrumental samples or even just the computer as a whole, the second that becomes the thing that is driving the writing process, it fails.
I see.
And so I don't, regardless of how convincing samples become, we will always need live players because you can't program emotion. And and it's really interesting too, because I think in some respects, we can all be terrified and scared that our jobs are just going to go away. Right. But I mean, there's AI composers that are coming out right now.
What?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I heard that Spotify has software that just kind of creates music, and then that way they don't have to pay any licensing or rights or anything.
I wonder, you know that song, da-na-na-na-na-na-na, like the song that always plays on the Spotify commercials? You guys probably all have premium. I'm probably the only cat in here that still is listening to the advertisements.
Shout out to ad free.
Right, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. It's kind of formulaic. Production music as a whole, commercial music as a whole, can tend to be a little formulaic.
So then, bust my bubble here. Out of everything in TV and film today, how much of it is all digital?
Oh, it depends on how well programmed it is for me to be able to say. I mean, like a lot of television for budgetary reasons tends to be sampled instrumentation. However, there's a caveat with a handful of live players that come in. So, for example, on this last pilot I was on, actually, I'm very blessed. My wife is a lovely singer as well. And they said, you know, we really want vocals in this. We really want a female vocal because there was something about the narrative that reinforced that decision. And I mean, I pulled up a sample. It's just like, it's not doing it for me. And so I yelled, honey, can you come down here, please? And you know, she was kind enough to come and track it for me, and the directors loved it. So I guess the point being, it's really hard to tell because she was in a bed of sampled instrumentation, you know? And so I'd say more often than it being one or the other, it's often a dualism of both kind of functioning in tandem with one another.
Yeah.
So over and over, you know, you've been using this phrase commercial music.
Sure.
How about you demystify that for folks? What is commercial music? How do you define commercial music as it applies to your job anyway?
Sure. So, I mean, commercial media we could define as anything that's sold for a profit if you really want to define it that way. But when I talk about commercial music, I'm kind of talking about the thriving advertising scene that we have kind of right here in the Twin Cities. So when I first moved away from Minneapolis, I had no idea that there was amazing things happening here. Carmichael is here, Fallon is here, you know, all those big ad agencies are right here in Minneapolis. So essentially when I'm talking about commercial music, I'm talking about any piece of underscore that is assisting in the process of selling a product or a service, right? So unlike film and television music, which happens to be more narrative, you know, and a good commercial can be narrative too. We've seen, I think it was a Subway commercial. Okay, shout out to Subway. We got to pay for that, right?
Eat fresh, sure.
Yeah. But basically, I mean, it was this beautiful piece of film with a really moving score, and then Subway logo pops up.
Yeah.
So in terms of like what is actually commercial music and what score, companies are constantly having to reinvent the wheel and find a way to hold attention when there's less and less and less of it to go around. So I would say commercial music, this is the longest answer in the world, is a means of selling a product, but I would say that line is getting blurred with underscore.
Vela, with you're playing so much of this commercial music, do you ever think about your role as a musician, as someone who's helping to sell these Subway sandwiches, or you know, do you ever, is there ever a project that you don't feel completely comfortable participating in based on what it's for?
You know, I haven't played for that many commercial gigs. To be honest, most of it has been with Will, and everything that Will has done has been great. So usually I'm playing, you know, in quartets and orchestras and, you know, stuff like that, and more personal stuff. So, you know, if it were to come to that, though, part of it is, you know, I have a job, so that's really awesome. You know, it's great that, you know, you need me, you know.
Yeah.
You have to sell yourself a little bit, I think, in order to be successful. So it's a balance, you know, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, I really like that, though, because like that is the real question. How do I maintain artistic integrity, but still realize that I am, in fact, selling a service at the end of the day? At the end of the day, I have two versions of every cue I write. One's for me, and then one is for the director and the producer. Whether it's a commercial or film or TV show, doesn't matter. The first one's for me, and this is how I think it's supposed to be. And then every subsequent revision, sometimes we arrive at a better place. And I'd say, actually, I've been really, really lucky. The last several collaborations I've had, the visions have really lined up really well. But all the subsequent revisions are sometimes, you know, the realization that you're delivering a service. So I'm going to make these changes, even though I would perhaps do it differently. I did it in my first draft, right? I'm still going to make these changes because at the end of the day, you serve at the pleasure of the director.
You know, Scott, that reminds Will saying that reminds me of the idea of, you know, sometimes having to put our personal feelings about music or music's role aside when we, you know, present certain things.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe that's a good segue into, you know, the sorts of aesthetics that we center in this genre we call classical music. So while names like Mozart and Beethoven are very familiar, sounds like John Williams are very familiar, or even James Horner, Bernard Herrmann, and you know, these sorts of names. Will, can you talk a little bit about your philosophy when it comes to the conversation of classical music in a broader sense? Do you feel like, you know, some of the sounds you create can make their way into the center part of what we consider classical music?
Sure. Yeah. So the question is, the sounds that I create, how can that kind of live alongside classical music?
Right. Or even become the focus one day, maybe.
Right. Well, I mean, it's really funny. Canon, in terms of repertoire, only becomes canon because enough people have decided that it is, you know, and because enough time has elapsed and passed for enough people to make that collective decision, right? So enough people decided that Bach is a genius, which he was. I'm just going to state my humble opinion.
Okay, speaking
right?
truth.
But the other interesting thing, we were talking about The Mandalorian kind of beforehand, and sort of the new Disney Plus series that's coming out. I had a colleague come over, and this is kind of a roundabout way of answering the question, but I had a colleague come over, and we were listening to a couple of cues from The Mandalorian, and he was kind of uncomfortable with the whole thing. He was like, you know, this doesn't sound like Williams. You know, and this is a kid that grew up with Star Wars, you know, and suddenly when you're presented with something that doesn't match the canon, doesn't match the repertoire, in quotes, people get uncomfortable, right? So we have had enough time slowly in film music where we're arriving at a place where a score that came out in the 70s, 50 years ago, right, is suddenly becoming canon.
Right.
You know, so I'd say the whole process is just going to repeat itself along film score too, because it's just doing what much of opera music did. It's supporting a narrative and a drama, you know? So I think we run the risk of maybe making some of the same mistakes and idolizing canon and putting it in a museum and not treating it as a living, breathing, organic piece of art.
Yeah.
If we're not careful, I think the same thing could actually happen to film music.
Vela, I wonder if you have an opinion on that, you know, the idea of where the oral definition of classical music is going based on the sort of subgenre of classical music that you guys work in.
Yeah, you know, it's definitely evolving. I can feel it in myself because, you know, as a music student, I take contemporary music classes, and to me, when I was kind of starting to listen to that kind of music, I didn't really like it very much, you know, and it seemed very sort of out there to me, just like you were saying, Will, about that guy, you know, hearing Mandalorian, and it's so different. But as I've been exposed to it, now I'm starting to categorize it in the same area as classical music, you know, up to a point. And I think we're always being pushed by artists to change our perspective.
Sure.
And like The Mandalorian, I think that I actually just watched it last night.
Oh, did you?
The 3 episodes.
It is good.
Yeah. And my husband and I were talking how cool it is that this music is different, you know, and how, you know, we were super into it maybe because we have a different perspective, but how it's really going to push everybody else to start feeling comfortable, you know, listening to that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting how we talk about the way that we present this on the air, and you know, we always, you know, you can't get through a piece that you don't like and jump on the air and go, boy, that just kept going, didn't it? You know,
well, you can.
You know, well, I mean, you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to. The thing that I was, the comparison that I was trying to draw is how you have a certain set of classical listeners that like the Bach, the Beethoven, the Brahms, and then anything beyond that sounds too different. Like, ooh, I don't like that. So now here we are with, you know, somebody who grew up with Star Wars and loving the Williams, who completely nicked it off of Holst. And
Right.
and now they're
Mars, right?
And now they're going there. Now they're saying, oh, this new Mandalorian thing doesn't sound like. How do we break past that? How do we set people up to not expect something and instead take in what you've put together?
I mean, I don't think you have to. I think you have to understand that I think there are always going to be naysayers in every single artistic endeavor, right? And I think this comes from the fact that we forget that every piece of music at one point was new, right? New makes people uncomfortable. The reason we survived is because coming out of the cave was scary, right? Saber-toothed tigers had sharp teeth. It's a survival thing, right? That's why New is bad. The Croods, it's a delightful film with a fabulous score. It's built around this whole thing of New is scary. Definitely worth a watch.
The Crew.
The Croods.
Okay. Oh, the Croods.
It's a lovely animated film
Sure.
with a score by Alan Silvestri. Anyhow, all music was new, and that's going to make people uncomfortable. And I think if we make allowances for enough time to elapse, it will be celebrated. And but it's tough too, because need we necessarily wait for time to elapse? Can we celebrate art as it is emerging? So I think those two things are going to kind of have to happen at the same time, both a continued effort to celebrate new art, but also understanding that new is scary for a lot of people and that will change.
Who are we listening to now that you think in the future is going to be one that we point to as a master? You know, like who has staying power?
I think Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross are doing some really interesting things.
I was going to say Trent Reznor.
Yeah,
You made Scott happy.
I think they're doing some really wild things. I see kind of. I mean, this happens in all music. Music always comes full circle, right? We always kind of start somewhere, and then we say, "Oh, that's old. Let's not do that anymore." And then we go around the circle, and then suddenly we arrive again. I think
Like fashion or anything
right,
else.
exactly. It's all cyclical. So I think in some respects, we're experiencing a second or third love affair with electronics from the 80s. And I think Reznor and Ross are doing some really dope stuff with electronics right now. And I think they're going to continue to be celebrated. And there's this constant blurring between what functions as underscore in a film and what functions as sound design. So the short film that I'm on right now, much of the underscore is just drones. You know, it's really Betty synthesizers with an occasional acoustic guitar, God willing, a piano, you know. But for the most part, it's very ambient, it's very understated, and if it could be night air in some of these scenes, you know, it's almost doubling as sound design. So I think Reznor and Ross are gonna be kind of grandfathered into that canon of what's new and cool.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Who was it that wrote For Us and
Oh, goodness.
Get Out?
Oh, that was only because you asked me. It's oh my God, very important black composer, and his name is Abels, Michael Abels. Yeah.
He was experimenting with incredible chants, I think in Swahili and things like that. I mean, he was doing really neat experimental things. And to illustrate it, I'm sure that some people have taken a listen to Us or The Social Network or
which won an Academy Award, I think, if I
right,
remember.
exactly. So celebrated, but I'm sure there were plenty of people out there that listened to it and listened to some of these strange chants. I'm using strange in quotes.
Sure.
And listened to this repeated piano motif that Reznor and Ross did, and thought, what is this? But now here we are. It's won an Academy Award, and it's absolutely celebrated. And I think it's going to continue to set trends in terms of what's happening in media music.
Yeah.
So again, scary, but it can change people's perspectives with time.
I mean, Vela, you already mentioned that, taking these contemporary music classes sort of served as your introduction, but you started to appreciate it. What was the connection there? What made you go from, oh, this sounds strange, to, oh, this is really important music?
Yeah, I think it was playing it.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of my approach to practicing it, and how do I kind of understand how to make this emotional, and at first maybe you think, oh, this isn't emotional, but then you realize this is very emotional. It's just a different way to express an emotion. In the end, it's the same as Brahms. It's just, a different articulation or different things like that. But once you realize that, then you get totally absorbed in a different way. And it's kind of, to me, when I think of more contemporary music, it's kind of more savory in a way.
Yeah.
And
More seasoned.
Yeah. And, you just start appreciating it so much that it can even have more of an emotional impact because it's not as familiar.
Yeah. And that's how I really get into just some of the pop songs I love, just getting to experience them more by sitting in front of my keyboard with lead sheet or whatever and just playing through it. Yeah, that's definitely a great way. But I wonder what you would say to the non-musician and how they can bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, attaching it to a movie is always great because that's familiar to people. They can start to understand it in that way because it's difficult, especially contemporary music, to get that out to the general public. It's difficult to just go and, you want to go and listen to this now. So I think finding ways that people are comfortable with and then inserting it that way,
Right.
so that almost people don't realize it and then it starts to become, part of them.
And in a way, I think that applies to even some of the more quote unquote traditional pieces of music because, Scott, one of my big challenges was, and still is in a way, why we air opera over the radio without the reinforcement of the staging and the super titles. How, that music can just be so intimidating if you don't have that experience. But if you go see, the Magic Flute, you're seeing this really fun story go down and you're understanding the music in that way,
Can you imagine Wagner without the action? As like a first-time listener, like how intimidating that would be?
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
Garrett and I often tell people, well, if they ask us for like a start point for classical, then pointing them to their favorite soundtrack is a good place to start. It seems like writing for film and television might be a lifeline for some of the classical music. It might be a gateway drug. What do you think about that?
I think I'm going to go watch Michael Giacchino's score for Up this Friday.
Oh, yeah.
I think orchestras are catching on, and I think program directors are catching on that it could be a lifeline for what is unfortunately sometimes a general lack of interest in Western classical music. And it's really interesting. I was kind of thinking as we were talking, if we listen to a soundtrack on its own, take, for example, an incredible composer, outstanding orchestrator like John Powell. You listen to a score like How to Train Your Dragon or something like that. This is dense orchestral writing, albeit it's maybe a bit more melodic than what we would traditionally hear in orchestra hall. But I mean, it's really dense, classically late romantic inspired music, I think what film music is doing is effectively branding itself. Because you're taking music that, for all intensive purposes, might not be all that different from the rest of Western classical repertoire, and you're attaching it to something that has social capital.
But is that branding, does that branding play a role in keeping it separated from the normal canon? I mean, when we, because as an orchestral musician, I would love to play the movie pops shows, playing along with the score to Harry Potter or whatever. But again, why not have that music on the same concert as your Beethoven symphony or whatever?
Dude, you make it happen, I'm there. For real, because I think a lot of people would be too. And I think, kind of to Scott's point, I think it kind of can be a quote-unquote gateway drug, because maybe it's the score for Star Wars that gets someone in the concert hall, right? And then they have that experience. They're watching the movie, they're seeing the players, and maybe then that little voice that lives in the back of all of our heads says, hey, what if we just tried Magic Flute?
Yeah.
Maybe we should come back and get tickets for something else because I think this would be good for my kids, or I really enjoyed this. I do think that there is a pivot point there that could happen. So it might be separate right now, but I think I could envision a time where the two scenarios could end up running into one another.
Right. And then on my end, and Vela, I'm sure you can speak to it. I mentioned Harry Potter. There's no page of music more difficult than the Quidditch match in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Do you have you through the perform? And I think you touched on this before, but again, through the performance of some of this music, I'm sure it's heightened your appreciation for the process of it, not just the sound of the music, but the folks who create these original recordings of these scores, and then even, of course, the folks who write the music itself.
Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. I mean, I actually watched the Minnesota Orchestra playing the Harry Potter.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, yeah.
How did
a
they
few
do?
weeks ago. It was amazing. I had so much fun, and I was kind of tentative coming from a super classical background, like, oh, I'm going to go to that one. But it was so cool. And the best part about it was how many people were there, watching. I just think, like Will was saying, it is like, even if it's just that one concert and there's no Brahms or Beethoven being performed, the people seem to enjoy it so much, and I think that's just a step forward,
Yeah.
and it's so cool. And like you said, it is difficult, it's challenging music, and yeah, I just think it's really cool.
And for me, and that validates it even more when you have these concert halls packed. I remember years ago in Detroit, we did who wrote the music for, I should know, it wasn't an Elfman Pops, but it was the guy who like illustrated The Nightmare Before Christmas, but also produced Pee-wee's Playhouse. So that person, and then all of the music connected to that, and you couldn't walk into the building. There were people standing in the lobby who
Yep.
didn't have tickets, just trying to hear what they can. And with all due respect to Debussy and Rachmaninoff and all those people, it's just not the same thing. That does not happen in 2019.
Right. And I don't think there's any reason that it can. And actually, to your point, Vel, I thought it was really interesting. You said you were almost tentative and had a blast
Yeah.
when you went. I think we've got a person that has experienced a pivot point. Not that Vela hasn't absolutely embraced modern music. I've been fortunate enough to have her on a ton of projects that involve modern music. But I mean, I think we have someone in the studio that has embraced that pivot point.
Pivot point is a great way to put it, because what about the person who's spending 4 to 6 hours a day playing video games? And
Right.
they get that sort of soundtrack going through their mind. And then when they're away from the video game and they hear the radio, it's not as lush or involved or anything. So maybe that would be a pivot point for them.
And,
Right.
and you mentioned video game music. I could sit here for an hour and talk about Final Fantasy VII, period.
Oh, my
just
goodness.
But just that in itself. And then, Scott, sometimes we do play some of those, the composer's Nobuo Uematsu. Sometimes we air some of his music. And every single time, 1,000% of the time, I'm getting all these emails about their memories of this or hearing
Yes.
this music there. Yeah, we haven't really touched on video game music much, but it seems like that is in the same conversation, basically.
I mean, game music is just as involved and dense and expensive as film music is now. And I mean, when you think about it, games are grossing far more than the box office.
Yeah.
In many respects, So I wouldn't be surprised at all if that kind of becomes the new operatic form of expression for composers, so to
Yeah,
speak,
yeah.
in terms of accompanying visuals. I mean, if you look at scores for games like Ori was a recent one that we just got through at my house. I mean, English composer, his name is escaping me, unfortunately. Gorgeous live score that was actually recorded down in Nashville.
Oh, okay, really? Okay, yeah.
Ocean Way, I think that was the studio
Okay.
they did it at. And I mean, Shadows of War, I mean, really gorgeous experimental use of non-Western sounds, gorgeous orchestrations. I mean, it's on par, and it has been for some time with how involved film music can be sometimes. And in respect of what you're expected to deliver for video game music, it's very dense, far denser, because you have one possible permutation of a film, right? Excluding director's cuts and everything else.
Sure.
But you have one possibility in terms of an outcome. For games, you have choices, and you have path deviations, and you have situations, and so you have all of these individual layers of music that will either be triggered or not triggered,
Sure.
depending upon the scenario. So in some respects, I haven't worked much in video game music myself, but it's very dense.
And
Very,
you
very
and you
dense.
mentioned the expense of it all. I want to talk about that for a couple seconds.
Sure.
I mean, how does it seems like the expense of commercial music can create a barrier for a lot of people who might be interested in entering that world.
Sure. You expensive in terms of producing it, or expensive in terms of entrance for like a composer to get involved?
Well, I mean, if I want to become a commercial music composer today, there's certain software and there's certain hardware
Sure.
that I need, and it's not free, right?
Right. I think the really cool thing that is happening, though, is I think that there's a level of accessibility that we're approaching. I mean, a lot of us work from home. You know, a lot of us don't have a fully treated studio with an ISO booth. Maybe we have a Moog synthesizer, a MIDI keyboard, couple of monitors, and some speakers. Maybe that's our setup. And I think that there are people that are just as lethal, so to speak, in their composing abilities with that rig as some of us that maybe have a fully spun out studio out of our houses. I don't think that there needs to be this huge barrier of entry. I mean, yeah, so like a copy of Logic is what, $200, and you've got a whole raft load of sounds. I think once you get into things like orchestral programming and stuff like that, that can become more cost prohibitive for composers to get involved in, because that software does tend to be more expensive.
Did you see cost, Vela, as a barrier? The further you get into this style of music, or any other barriers that folks might not think about that are unique to this?
I mean, cost is always a barrier as a cellist,
Sure.
Just my instrument is a barrier.
That G string isn't cheap, right?
No, I mean, it's really not. And that's something that I'm still figuring out. I mean, throughout college, I played on a cello that I was borrowing, from the school. And then I had to play my cello, which I'm playing on now, which isn't the ideal setup for me, But I think it's easy to get, because there are so many options now of how to make this better and better and better. It's easy to get stuck because you're waiting to get that better thing. So I think it's important to just use what you have for now and not get blocked by it. I'm still struggling with that. I practice my cello and I'm like, I feel like it can just do a little bit more, and I can feel it inside, but it's not doing it.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to get frustrated. So yeah, I'm still figuring it out, but hopefully, I'm saving up for my next cello. So yeah.
I've had many sessions in the practice room screaming at my bassoon, why won't you do what I'm telling you to do? So I definitely know that. But so much of what the two of you are saying is bringing me back again to this idea of the sound, the aural aesthetic that we're centering as we move forward in classical music. Vela, you said it's easy to get stuck. And that's how I feel about programming these days. It's so easy to get stuck on this sound that is just, a little old and a little, dare I say, outdated. But, with those connections being there, it can really be demystified. So, on that note, I'm wondering if the two of you have suggested listening for movie scores or some sort of other commercial music that could really make one of those traditionalists in classical music say, oh, wow, this is some really incredible music too.
I think historically speaking, we keep talking about pivot points today. That seems to be kind of the theme. I think folks like Philip Glass are a really important pivot point.
And he is such a polarizing composer.
Right. So but certainly his repertoire, you know what I mean? And I think that that's a place to start, because sometimes people that enjoy classical music, especially on an academic level, can talk comfortably about Glass and Brahms.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They're in different sections of the same textbook at the very least,
Sure.
So, I mean, maybe experimental is a good place to start. Throw yourself into the deep end. Pull up The Social Network,
It's a great one.
Watch that movie, and maybe even don't just listen. Maybe watch too. Maybe that is in fact the gateway, because I mean, even just via osmosis, we can soak things in and we can absorb it even if we don't consciously do it. So I would say continue watching films. Social Network would be a good place to start. Meet Joe Black. And I know we were talking about this one beforehand. Thomas Newman's a favorite of mine. I think he writes very melodically. And he also does some more experimental things with electronics and the orchestra. That might also be a good pivot point. Any one of his scores, truly, and any one of the films he's worked on would be a great jumping off point for folks that are just kind of getting acclimated to new music.
Yeah. What would you consider, Vela, a good pivot point for folks, especially all of, because you said your mother is an opera singer and would have students coming in. And I'm sure that these students are, focused as a student should be in the repertoire that, could potentially give them a job. But, again, for you, what would be those suggested pivot points for folks?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think a lot of art movies are a great point to start, because they are often more aware of the composers that they're using. For example, the movie Under the Skin. The soundtrack is so cool. It's a female composer, and it's quite out there, but it's an amazing soundtrack. That's maybe a little bit out there. But
Sure.
but then also, like Will was saying, movies like Up. I mean, that soundtrack was beautiful.
Yeah.
I need to watch that again because I've only seen it once and I still remember that it was so beautiful. So yeah, just exploring different styles of movies as well.
Yeah. And as we begin to wrap up here, we were talking a lot about The Mandalorian, and when I think about Princess Leia's theme, it almost makes me misty because I think about this woman, this real life woman who played this character who might as well have been real, and how this piece of music sort of immortalizes her. Last week I was talking about this concept because I aired Elgar's Enigma variations and how he immortalized his friends through those different variations, and the same is happening in film and commercial music, and I feel like it deserves equal standing, not separate but equal standing in the genre, in the concert hall, on the radio, and everywhere else the music exists.
I'm very biased, but I couldn't agree more.
Great. I'm glad. So, Vela, for folks who, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about the piece of music that we're going to hear, but Vela, if folks want to learn more about you or maybe even book you, how can they how can they do that?
They can reach me. I have a website, velafarquharson.com.
Yeah.
They can reach me there. I'm on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, also email. But whatever.
Yeah, you're very accessible.
Yeah.
What about you, Will? How can the next advertiser ask you to write the masterpiece they need to sell Snickers bars or whatever?
Unfortunately, I'm not on the gram. My wife has that covered for the both of us.
Oh, nice.
But I have a website, willvandercrommert.com, and it's a painfully long last name, but there's only one of me, I promise.
Okay.
So that's probably the best way to hear my work and get hold of me.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for being on TRILLOQUY today. Can you tell us a little bit about the piece of music that we're going to hear?
Sure. So the piece of music we're going to be hearing is based, it comes from a web series that I just completed. The web series was out of Los Angeles. It was directed and produced by two of my very favorite now collaborators, directed by a gentleman named Charlie Roth and produced by Bruno Xavier. And Quinn's Place is very interesting from the standpoint that it's 10 episodes, and every episode we start from scratch, right? The only thing that remains constant is the place. So we find ourselves in an Airbnb, and we find ourselves in that same Airbnb every single episode. But what changes is the characters that arrive, the experiences that they have, and maybe one character will leave something behind, which will affect the trajectory of the next character. And so, it was just a blast to collaborate with them, and they've submitted to Tribeca, Sundance, and several others. So hopefully we're going to get some play here soon too.
So paint the picture of this piece of music.
So
who's staying in the Airbnb now?
So the very little plot details that won't go beyond the bounds of my non-disclosure agreement.
Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah, commercial music.
All right, I know. So essentially, in this portion, it's in one of the latter episodes, and we find one of our characters in a very emotional, pivotal moment, and that's about as vague as I can be.
I guess we found the title of this one, Pivot Point, right? We've used that phrase a lot. All right. Well, thanks again to the both of you. It's really been great.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.